My name is Hala. I'm the Director of Communications for the Georgetown MENA Forum. And this event also holds a special place in my heart because Shireen was a relative of mine. And I wanted to thank you for coming to the film screening, the panel discussion, and Q&A to commemorate the one-year anniversary of the Israeli killing of Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. So the Middle East and North Africa Forum promotes awareness on campus of pressing regional issues and helps foster graduate student engagement with Georgetown faculty and policy experts. So the MENA Forum program this afternoon is brought to you in partnership with the Georgetown Center for Contemporary Studies, the Georgetown Master's Program in Communication, Culture, Technology, the School of Foreign Service, and the Middle Eastern and North African Law Students Association at Georgetown Law and American University School of Communications. If we could give a round of applause for our sponsors. Thank you. And I also wanted to thank my fellow board members, Abraham, Rowan, Sahila, and Danny for making this event possible. And most of all, I want to thank our moderator and Professor Fida Adely, and our four expert panelists, Khaled Elgindy, Sherif Mansour, Zaha Hassan, and Yousef Munayyer. So lastly, the MENA Forum owes a special debt of gratitude to Adely, a Palestinian journalist based in the West Bank, who is a colleague and close personal friend of Shireen. And this event was inspired by her commitment to Shireen and the family. And lastly, I just wanted to say that Shireen was a veteran of Palestinian American journalists who covered the region and beyond for 2 decades. She was a household name. Her killing shook her family, friends, and loved one, and every person who had seen her coverage on Palestine on the television screen. So 1 year later, justice has still not been served. The Israeli soldier who shot her to death remains free and no accountability has been taken. As we near May 11th, which is the 1-year anniversary, we pay tribute to Shireen's life and legacy. We answer questions about the chilling effect of her death that has had on other journalists in Palestine, especially women in the media. And we look to what the US has done to bring justice to one of their own and what numerous investigations into her death have found.
While it is recognized that not everyone may share the same views as the speakers, it is expected that everyone in attendance at this event respects the right of the speakers and the organizing groups to share their perspectives and ideas by not causing a disruption at the event's activities. At the conclusion of this panel, there will be a Q&A session where you may ask your questions and engage in dialogue. Please be sure to phrase your comments in the form of a question. In the interest of time, so everyone has the opportunity to ask a question, we ask that each person be concise and ask only one question. Thank you.
Thank you, Coco. So I'll be moderating our panel. It's really hard to shift gears after watching such a sobering documentary. Even though many of us have seen these scenes before, it's still quite troubling to see it again. And I have to say this, particularly the funeral scene. I had forgotten, but not forgotten how horrible it was to see a Palestinian journalist killed, but then even in death, be once again oppressed. So I think it was part of what made the killing that much more worse for Palestinians and for many others who were watching what was happening at that time. So today we have 4 panelists, and in a moment I'm going to give a fuller introduction of each of our panelists. Then I'm going to ask each panelist to share brief comments, 2 to 3 minutes. And then I have some questions to get a conversation going amongst us up here. And then we will open it up to the audience. So let me just start by introducing our guests today. So I'll start here on my left, Khaled Elgindy. Khaled Elgindy is an adjunct instructor here at the Georgetown Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and is the director of the program on Palestine and Palestinian-Israeli Affairs at the Middle East Institute. He's the author of the book Blind Spot, America and the Palestinians from Balfour to Trump, published by the Brookings Institution Press in 2019. Khaled previously served as resident scholar in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution from 2010 to 2018. Prior to arriving at Brookings, he served as an advisor to the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah on permanent status negotiations with Israel from 2004 to 2009 and was a key participant in the Annapolis negotiations in 2007 and 2008. Next to Khaled is, sorry, I've got my bios out of order, Yousef Munayyer. Yousef is a non-resident senior fellow at the Arab Center for Washington, D.C., the Arab Center in Washington, D.C., where he focuses on Palestinian-Israeli issues and the role of the United States therein. He also serves as a member of the editorial committee of the Journal of Palestine Studies. He previously directed the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, the Jerusalem Fund for Education and Community Development, and its educational program, the Palestine Center. Additionally, he has served as a policy analyst with the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, and we also hope he'll be teaching a class for us next year. And to my right is Zaha Hassan. Zaha Hassan is a human rights lawyer and a fellow at the Middle East program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Her research focus is on the Palestinian-Israeli peace, the use of international legal mechanisms by political movements, and U.S. foreign policy in the region. Previously, she was the coordinator and senior legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team during Palestine's bid for UN membership, and was a member of the Palestinian delegation to Quartet-sponsored exploratory talks between 2011 and 2012. She regularly participates in Track 2 peace efforts and is a contributor to The Hill and Haaretz. And then next to Zaha is Sherif Mansour, an Egyptian-American democracy and human rights activist. He serves as the Middle East and North Africa program coordinator at the Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ. And before joining CPJ, Sherif worked with Freedom House, where he managed advocacy training for MENA activists. In 2010, he co-founded the Egyptian Association for Change, a Washington-based nonprofit group that mobilizes the Egyptians in the US to support democracy and human rights in Egypt. Sherif also monitored the Egyptian elections for the Ibn Khaldun Center for Development Studies and has worked as a freelance journalist. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us today. And perhaps I'll start with you, Sherif, and invite each of you to make brief comments before I ask a few questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for everyone here today and for all the organization who helped organize. This is going to be the first in a lot more public events we at CPG is going to start doing to commemorate this memory. And we have, of course, since day one, demanded that the US administration opens an FBI investigation, and we have supported international probes into Shireen Abu Akleh's killing. So our advocacy calls here are clear, and it's not just directed at the US government, but also the Israeli government. We have made recommendations that they reform their rules of engagement. We have for years also made recommendation that they respect press insignia, especially when the journalists are not posing a threat to IDF soldiers. And we continue to make publicly demands that they open criminal investigation into the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh and at least 2 other journalists, Palestinian journalists who died in 2018. That includes Yasser Murtaja and Ahmed Abu Hussein, who were covering the Gaza protests in 2018. What we have reported over the years is as many as 20 journalists who've been killed by IDF fire. Majority, 18, absolute majority are Palestinians, and 1 British and 1 Italian. And we at the committee have said that this in itself have for long been a point of tension. We have appealed and made every good measure, good and good faith measure to try and seek Israeli government right of reply to every incident. And we are going to continue to press the Israeli government and the US government, but not alone. We think this is something that has to continue to advance in the International Criminal Court. Al Jazeera have submitted a case. The Palestinian government is endorsing it. We want to make sure that the court takes its responsibility as well, not just the US government. But I want to finish with specific recommendation to the US government, and I want to ask that question clear of them. We are happy to see that they have opened an FBI investigation. We're happy to see that the administration have raised publicly and directly with the Israeli government that they should revise and reform the rules of engagements. And we want to see more from State Department. They can and should provide progress reports about where the FBI investigation is going. And we want, and we should see more action from Congress and the Senate in forcing State Department to provide these reports, but also to force a Leahy review in this incident. This is something Senator Leahy have called to be considered, and I think it's due and past due that we see happen. I'll stop here.
First, just thank you to the forum for inviting me, and to acknowledge and commemorate the life of Shireen. She had a huge impact on my life, and I wanted to share just some thoughts about why Shireen had such a huge impact on Palestinians, particularly Palestinians living in the diaspora and the Arab world writ large. First, just to say, I mean, when you watch this video, and I watched it just before coming here, what strikes me is just the look in the eyes of the eyewitnesses and even the journalist interviewing them, this sense that, of layered trauma. It's just it's so hard to watch because behind it is this idea that, accountability is probably not going to be there for Shireen's death like it hasn't been for so many others. But I just wanted to acknowledge that because it's really hard to talk after watching that again. So why did she have such an impact? Because as we've heard from Sherif, there's been a lot of Palestinian journalists that have gotten killed. There has, there's been a lot of Palestinians that have been killed on video, and we have the tapes of these things. Yes, she was a Palestinian woman who was beloved, but there have been a lot of Palestinian women who are beloved and professionals that have been killed, So what is it about Shireen that made the pallbearers at her funeral take those hits and still hold her up, And I think the reason why, if I, just thinking about myself and why she impacted me in my life is because, right after the signing of the Oslo Accords, this was after the first Intifada, and, all of a sudden Palestine went off the TV screens, and everyone thought it's all good. There's negotiations, and, there's going to be peace. And if we did hear about Palestine, it was to hear about, the negotiation process and how, they were on again, off again, and the problems between the leadership level. We weren't seeing what was going on at the ground level, and there was a sense like everything was okay on the ground level. It was just a matter of the political leadership on both sides, the occupation and the idea that there was an occupation disappeared from the United States scene. And for those of us, living in the United States at that time, especially, and then when the second Intifada started, the narrative that came out of the second Intifada was a completely, different narrative that capitalized on the 9/11 war on terror framing to lump Palestinian resistance and to lump the situation in Palestine in with, terrorism and the war on terror and Al-Qaeda. And there was this effort, there's a very concerted effort at the very highest levels of the US government to do this. And I remember the White House spokesperson, Ari Fleischer, telling journalists saying that it is un-American and disrespectful of, all of the lives lost in 9/11 for anyone to ask the question, why? Why would a Palestinian be engaged in political violence? Why would a Palestinian resist? It was completely inappropriate to do that. And you were labeled an un-American, for even asking those questions. And so what Shireen did for those of us in the US and around the world at this time when Al Jazeera, had this 24-hour news and was able to bring us images of what was going on in Palestine, was to allow us to see the truth about what's going on, and to get out of that framing, get out of that war on terror framing, to get back to the idea that there is an occupation, there's a violation of human rights, there's an amazing oppression that's not being addressed. And that was something throughout the Arab world that people could see. And they then were re-educated, because like I said, the peace process really clouded the understanding of what was going on in Palestine. And so Shireen brought that back. So when she got killed, it was as though we, were reverting back to some other time period in which we were going to, start to, frame Palestine as this issue of, Palestinian terrorists or a culture of martyrdom, and we just don't understand what's going on there. And so it hit all of us heavy for that reason. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Fida, and thank you to our organizers and to all of you for coming. I didn't know Shireen Abu Akleh personally, but I think like so many other millions of people really around the world, she was familiar because she was such a fixture on our TV screens, especially those of us who follow Palestinian and Israeli issues. But Shireen's life and death sort of intersected with me in another way, in that when she was murdered, at the very same moment, it just so happened that I was playing host to a group of Palestinian journalists here in Washington. And we were going around Washington, meeting with officials, doing training workshops, meeting with other journalists. And I'll never forget that morning when we sort of convened to begin our day. And of course, they had just seen the news of Shireen's killing, and that affected me deeply. And obviously, it affected them. All three of them knew Shireen personally. One was a personal colleague of hers at Al Jazeera. So it made it left an impression in that sense, and of course that became their mission to talk about Shireen in all of their official and unofficial meetings. And so it was a difficult time, certainly for them, but for me as well. The other point I will make, because I'm a policy person, I live in the policy world, and I feel like I have to say something on that level. To me, Shireen's murder, what it represents more than anything else, is a fundamental failure in U.S. policy for decades, and that is a total unwillingness to hold Israel accountable, really for anything, something as small as the settlement expansion. Home demolitions, virtually anything. I mean, so if you poll Middle East analysts, why did the U.S.-led peace process fail? I think the number one answer you're going to get from, if people are being honest, is that the U.S. consistently failed to hold Israel accountable. You would think that this moment might be different because Shireen Abu Akleh, after all, was an American citizen, and yet it wasn't any different than in the past. And I think that says a lot. If even an American citizen who is a very high profile personality, in the face of enormous media coverage. I mean, all of these media outlets did their own independent investigations, the Washington Post, the New York Times, human rights groups, in large part because of who she was and what she represented, right? You can imagine journalists care a lot about other journalists being killed in the line of duty. So even with all of the evidence, there was no inclination or hesitation at all to sort of bury their heads in the sand. I think it's impossible to look at that body of evidence and not see deliberate targeting. I think one would have to be seriously self-deluded. I think initially the administration, I think their outrage is sincere. I don't mean to discount that. But I think as the evidence mounted and as it became clear the issue wasn't going to go away, they sort of got impatient. I think they had hoped that it would be, the evidence would be much less compelling than it was. And so here we are, yet another instance of Israeli impunity. And unfortunately, it has a very, very long history in US policy.
Thank you all. This is perhaps the third or fourth time that I've seen that documentary, and each time that I watch it, it is impossible not to be moved and to be infuriated. And I think the product that we saw on the screen is a testament to the commitment of Shireen's Al Jazeera colleagues to the pursuit of truth and their continued commitment to justice for Shireen, for which I have nothing but the utmost respect. When I first heard the news about Shireen getting injured, and that's how I first read about the news, it came across on social media, on my Twitter feed, late at night here, and it would be a few hours after that before there was any confirmation that in fact that injury was fatal and that Shireen was killed. But immediately upon seeing that headline, something seemed off and something seemed very, very, very wrong. Shireen was a consummate professional. She had been covering intense conflict situations. And for those of us who were following the day-to-day events on the ground, we understood what was happening in Jenin in those moments, the level of violence. And Shireen has been, along with many of her colleagues, covering far more intense moments of violence than what was taking place in Jenin during those weeks. And they understood how to protect themselves. And from the moment I read that headline, it felt to me that there was much more going on here than an accident, that there's no way that this was incidental. And I think as we saw from the documentary, and as we saw from all of the evidence that has come out since, it's impossible to escape the conclusion that an Israeli marksman was staring in the face at his target as he pulled the trigger multiple times. And I will say a couple other things in relation to Shireen, and others have touched on her significance. Several years ago, when I was at the Jerusalem Fund, we hosted Shireen along with another Palestinian journalist, Tahrid al-Khudari, to talk about the challenges of covering Palestine. And the event is on YouTube. I would encourage all of you who are interested in this to check it out. I rewatched it recently and heard Shireen talk about some of the very things, some of the very failures in American coverage of the situation in Palestine that were so prevalent in the coverage of her death in American media outlets. And I think this is a big part of the story as well. She was incredibly dedicated to getting the voice of the voiceless out there, getting to parts of Palestine and parts of the story of Palestine out there that others often overlooked. And the last thing I would say, just in terms of this bigger conversation about policy and the idea of an investigation, I think it's important for us, and when I say us, I don't just mean those of us engaging this issue around the question of policy, but also us as Americans in this room, to wrestle with the reality that we are demanding an investigation from a party in the United States that is very much in on the crime. And that's something that I think we need to stare right in the face. The gun that was used to kill Shireen, the bullets that were used to kill Shireen were likely paid for by our tax dollars. The protection that the Israeli government gets diplomatically, internationally, to ensure that they have impunity before the United Nations, before the International Criminal Court, so that these kinds of things can continue happening. That's because of things that are taking place down the road in the city, the position of our government and our politicians here. That's something that we need to wrestle with. Shireen was killed in May of 2022. It wasn't ultimately clear at that point, but by the end of the year, the United Nations had announced that the year 2022 was the single deadliest year for Palestinians in the West Bank being killed by Israeli fire since they had been keeping track of those numbers in over 20 years. And so as important as it is to, of course, remember Shireen's contributions and to demand accountability for her death, it's part of this bigger story of the targeting of Palestinians and the total impunity that the Israeli military has when it comes to how it engages with Palestinians. This is a military that in 2018, when Palestinians were protesting in the Gaza Strip, before protests even began, they deployed 100 snipers down to the Gaza Strip. And on the first day of protests, after shooting numerous unarmed Palestinians, killing them and wounding many, many more, the military tweeted out, "We know where every bullet landed. We know where every bullet landed." So I leave you with that to think about as we look at the claims that this was an accident.
Questions we got online ahead of the event has already been addressed to a degree, but I'll just put it out there. Was a question about whether anyone thinks that that the FBI investigation is going to happen, whether anyone thinks that there's going to be an investigation undertaken on the part of the US. And it doesn't sound like anybody thinks that's going to happen, but I'm going to give you a chance. I mean, so is there any sense that something, because you've got someone like Van Hollen, right? You've got some folks within the US government saying something needs to be done. Is there anyone? Yeah, Sherif?
I think we made the point that Shireen Abu Akleh's murder is emblematic for Palestinian journalists. And I think we also need to make the point it's emblematic because it's the favorite talking points of autocrats around the world right now. When President Biden visited Israel and decided to just visit MBS right afterwards, the connections could not have been made clearer about what happened with Khashoggi, the US response to what happened to him, and what happened with Shireen and the US response to what happened to her. And it was told directly to President Biden by MBS himself. What are you going to do about Israel and Shireen Abu Akleh? It is also what the enemy of both, the Iranian foreign minister, have said when people in the media, NPR, confronted him about what the Iranian government is doing right now, jailing dozens of journalists. He responded, what is the US is going to do about Shireen Abu Akleh? So I think this is important for the US, for its own institutional integrity, to provide that response to the international community if they have any chance of making policies based on what they, the rhetoric they put out on press freedom versus what happens in the reality. We're going to continue to push on that point to make it not just about what the US policy is, but what the standard we hold this administration to for its citizens, for its alleged support for press freedom worldwide and in the Middle East region.
Thank you. Yeah.
So I just would point out that, the U.S. security coordinator had an opportunity to bring in the FBI with him as he was looking at what happened. And instead of doing that, what they did was they took the Palestinian Authority report, they took the Israeli report, and somehow, summarized the findings in a way that obviously leaned toward the Israeli report because they found that the killing was unintentional or likely unintentional. The only thing that was new was the forensic test, which came out inconclusive. And but we do know that the security coordinator did visit the site, so could have seen the where the bullets were fired and been able to have determined that they were targeting the head or shoulder and above. But we didn't hear anything about that. And, we don't even know if the security coordinator asked to talk to the soldiers that fired, or the soldier that fired on Shireen. So all of that makes me not very confident about the FBI. And for me, just knowing that the opening of the DOJ investigation happened after the new government in Israel came into power, and the idea that there was going to be a this Ministry of National Security that was going to be headed by a very right-wing ultranational extremist is probably why they decided to open up the investigation, or maybe it was a signal. We don't really know. Of course, the administration said, this was a completely independent decision made by the Department of Justice to open up an investigation. But, it's likely going to, take some time for that investigation. And I could see it wrapping up maybe after, after the Biden administration leaves office. I mean, these things tend to take a long time. The wheels of justice tend to turn very slowly when it comes to accountability for Palestinians in general. So we'll have to wait and see.
Thank you. Khaled, you want to say something?
Yeah, just briefly, I'm also not terribly optimistic. I mean, of course, the announcement that the FBI would conduct its own investigation was welcome, but I can imagine the investigation going nowhere and we're sort of just remaining open indefinitely, if only because Israel refuses to cooperate with them. But I think also there's going to be a deep reluctance on the part of Americans to really fully investigate, because to look closely at Shireen's murder, I think is also to kind of conduct a parallel investigation into Israeli rules of engagement and the rules under which Israeli soldiers are allowed under their own rules to use deadly fire against whoever they determine to be a threat. And I think we don't know what, obviously these are very kind of militarily or sort of tightly held military secrets. We can discern Israeli rules of engagement, but I think one thing is clear is that whatever the rules of engagement are, they have dramatically loosened over the past 15 to 20 years. And I think this is the fundamental can of worms that US officials and certainly Israeli officials desperately do not want to begin to open, because Shireen's investigation will naturally sort of cascade and open up all kinds of other skeletons, such as, not to use such a macabre pun, but yeah.
Thank you, Khaled. It's interesting you brought that up, because I also thought about a line in the movie, and one of the journalists said, "We fear their fear." It made me think a lot about the way in which police shootings in this country get talked about, like fear informed by racism and the kind of what are the rules of engagement for police when they determine that there's a threat. So I felt like that really connected to the ways in which that kind of violence in this country is talked about. And then, of course, there are the other connections, which is like the Israeli military is training police officers in Atlanta this week. So they're the kind of more direct connections. So one question I'd like to ask the panel, so you all are probably aware, right, that in 2021, the Israeli Defense Ministry issued a military order declaring 6 Palestinian civil society organizations, terrorist organizations, among them Al-Haq, who, you know, we had to hear the distorted voice of the Al-Haq researcher here because he or she is afraid to actually be known. So I'm just wondering how the criminalization of that kind of human rights work is impacting journalism, but even beyond journalism, impacting the ability of Palestinians to document these kinds of violations. Yeah, Sherif, you want to start us off? Yeah.
So in the case of Shireen Abu Akleh, and in the case of Yasser Murtaja, and in the case of the Associated Press, and in the case of a lot of the targets, individuals and media facilities, a lot of officials from the IDF and from the Israeli government would rush to say, we were just going after terrorists, we were stopping a terrorism operation, and we've always responded by raising the protections that journalists should not be deprived of under international humanitarian law. No government can render those protections obsolete just by saying we have the sole absolute power to decide who is the journalist and what is the response. And I think this is the standard we hold even the US government to. We at CPJ have criticized and protested the US government targeting of media offices for, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, even their support to the Saudi-led coalition airstrike in Yemen that killed 5 journalists. So this is the standard we have, is that no government, no matter where they are, especially if they claim to be democratic, can, just raise and not provide evidence or even names of their soldiers when they are pressed for accountability. This does not satisfy any standard for transparency or accountability, and we will not stop for nothing until we reach some sort of accountability here.
Anyone else?
Can I just jump in a little bit on this issue of fear that was raised? That line struck me as well. And I think there are certainly situations where that makes sense. But I try to think about the marksman, the Israeli marksman that was sitting in a armored vehicle 200 meters away, staring through a tiny little hole through a scope down a rifle, in which he was watching every single movement in this alleyway. How afraid of what? Afraid of what? In fact, it's the lack of fear that is driving all of this, the lack of fear of any consequences for the killing of Palestinians. And we saw several years ago with the execution of a prone Palestinian in Hebron. An Israeli soldier walked up to a Palestinian who had already been hit and on video executed him by shooting him essentially in the head. It created a gigantic controversy in Israel, and it ultimately led to the government collapsing because nobody wanted to take the position of preventing soldiers from being able to defend themselves in the field. They wanted to give them the maximum amount of support in any of these situations. These are the conditions in which these soldiers are operating. They know that they have the maximum amount of impunity when it comes to the targeting of Palestinians. I just wanted to add that because for me, it seems that's the dynamic.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think that's a really important point. I mean, it's interesting that it was expressed that way, but it is it does make sense that the lack of fear is really, and the lack of accountability is really what's functioning here. So one question I have is maybe thinking a bit more broadly. Some of you may have seen this recent poll, like the University of Maryland did, on kind of American perspectives on Israel and Palestine. And one of the findings was that 44% of Democrats who responded to this poll called Israel a state with segregation similar to apartheid. 20% of Republicans also agreed with this statement. So there's this narrative that there's a sense amongst many that is reflected in these kind of polls, that at least in the US, and this is true within the Jewish community too, based on these kind of polls within the US, there have been major shifts in the ways in which Americans think about Israel, think about the US support for Israel, to the point where even the word apartheid has been normalized now. I mean, the Palestinians have been using it for decades. You know, Jimmy Carter wrote it as the title of his book 20 years ago, but it's been normalized as a result of these human rights reports. It's decades of work in any event. But there's such a huge gap between that apparent shift in public opinion and the policy of the US, which for all intents and purposes hasn't changed one bit, right? Maybe it's even gotten more aligned with Israel in the last couple of decades than it was, you know, in the 80s and 90s. I don't know. You policy folks tell me if that's true, but I have a sense that it's even more aligned, but from my reading of it. But in any event, so this is my question. I mean, do you agree with the fact that there has been a shift, and then any thoughts about kind of the gap between the two, gap between policy and the shift in perspective, and if you see any hope in this kind of change in public opinion? So it's a bunch of questions, but yeah.
I could say a few words about that, I guess. So, you know, a while back, I just got this idea that I wanted to see, where this idea that, we recognize Israel as a Jewish state came into play in party platforms, the Republican Party platform and the Democratic Party platform. So I looked back to see when did this first start, and I assumed it was going to be in the Republican Party platform because, they tend to be more, supportive of Israel. And, Democrats are thinking more along the lines of two states and equality, within those states and that kind of thing. So my assumption was that it was going to have come from the Republicans, but actually it came from the Democrats. It was something that originated when Secretary Kerry was running for president, and it entered the party platform the year that he was running. And it sort of made sense to me in some ways when I thought about it, because there's been such a battle during the Democratic National Committee meetings on the party platform, where there's been a lot of just gatekeeping to prevent the bubbling up of what the Democrats are feeling about Israel and U.S. policy towards Israel and the Palestinians. There's been a lot of gatekeeping to prevent that perspective from entering the party platform. And I'm wondering why. Why is it, since the party platform is really an aspirational document, it's not going to change anything, right? But it's a statement of where Democrats stand. So why is there such a big fight about letting human rights perspectives enter into the debate and discussion and into the party platform? And at the end of the day, you have to understand that the party platform is marketing material for campaigns to raise money. And so, of course, the Democratic leadership, they want to raise money and they want to appeal to funders of campaigns, and they're in competition with the Republican candidates in this regard. So that explains this drive to quelch the debate and discussion within the Democratic Party around human rights and in the context of Israel-Palestine. So it's not that the Democrats writ large, or even Americans writ large, don't understand that the injustice when when it's explained to them, and don't, fall on the side of, equality when you talk about, well, what should the situation be between Israelis and Palestinians if there isn't going to be a two-state solution? I mean, people just come up and they say, yeah, equal rights for all, they live together, what's happening is there's a leadership, an elite leadership within the Democratic Party that's been preventing this sentiment from becoming, the standard for the party. And so that's where this is coming from, and it's unfortunate, but it's the reality of the fact of how elections are paid for in this country that we have to factor in when we think about how to change policy.
It's one of the interesting things about that poll, and folks should check it out for more of the details, is that they actually asked respondents, they said, which one of these best sort of fits your understanding of what Israel is? And, it was like a democracy, a flawed democracy, something more like apartheid, and so on. And so people had the option, right, of saying, it's a democracy or a flawed democracy. And yet the majority of, or the single largest chunk of Democrats said it looked more like apartheid. And to me, that was stunning, because it's hard to think of another talking point that's been repeated more ad nauseum in the context of the U.S.-Israel relationship than this idea that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Like, it's repeated over and over and over again by policymakers and opinion shapers and so on. And yet people aren't buying it. And I think those shifts are important. At the same time, these shifts are significant. There are other countries too where there's far more sympathetic public opinion towards Palestinians, and yet government policy does not follow suit. The United States is not necessarily an outlier in this regard. The reality is that policy is often quite separate from public opinion because of all the institutions like political parties that get in the way. I do think it represents an opening for change, though. But it's perhaps a change that we're still at the very beginning of.
Up to the, sorry, excuse me. Yes, we're going to open it up to the audience. So we have a mic right there. If anyone has questions. Okay. And please just state who you are before your question. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. My name is Omar. I'm a freshman in the School of Foreign Service. My question is relating to the current state of the Israeli government, which is not very stable, to say the least, and hasn't been for a couple of months at this point. And their activities have been in blatant disregard of standard U.S. foreign policy and what the government has been officially stating to them, which doesn't seem to have been working very effectively. So do you think that the U.S. government's official stance on human rights, or they might be able to put more pressure on the Israeli government to observe human rights or initiate more investigations like this as a method to force Israel back in line with U.S. policy objectives? Or do you think that that byproduct probably won't end up happening? Thank you.
Take a stab. So, I mean, it's curious, because one thing I've noticed about this administration is they don't get particularly worked up in terms of Palestinian deaths and injuries or rights violations, but they did get kind of worked up with this judicial overhaul and sort of, whoa, this is crossing a line. Israel's venturing into non-democracy territory now. And I think it's the same sort of realization that Israelis had of, they've been living next door to, and some places literally across the street from, daily violations of people's rights. You have an entire a nation, an entire population that is being ruled under an authoritarian regime of martial law, and it's the same regime, in fact, that that is Israel's a presumably vibrant democracy. And so that dissonance exists certainly in Israel. And because most American politicians view Israel and Palestinians through a very Israeli lens, they also woke up to this. But there's a gap between violations of Israeli rights, particularly the Jewish majority, and violations of Palestinian rights, which is just sort of, well, that's just however they rationalize it away. Oh, it's temporary because we're in the middle of a peace process that hadn't succeeded yet. We believe in a two-state solution, and that will be the answer to all these problems. And so it sort of highlights this fundamental dissonance that as long as the status quo is the costs of the status quo are paid mainly by Palestinians, then it's acceptable. Now that it's kind of tipping over and also affecting Israelis, it's seriously problematic. So I'm not. I think if anything is going to bring about change for Palestinians, it probably will be as a result of overreach with regard to the Israeli population itself.
We're honoring the life and legacy of this one Palestinian female heroine today, Shireens Legacy. I'm wondering if you could speak to something about Shireen in the U.S. government, what her representation as the first female Palestinian congresswoman means, and perhaps Zaha and other figures we can think of.
Anyone want to speak on Shireen?
Well, I mean, I think every society is stronger when they are fully represented across all different divides, whether it's ethnic or racial or gender or anything like that. And Shireen Abu Akleh, I think, was a real icon and someone who really stood out and was an inspiration to Palestinians everywhere, and also Palestinian women. And I don't think we can understate that. And as far as Representative Tlaib is concerned, obviously being the first Palestinian American woman in Congress is a historic thing, and I think it represents a broader change in American politics, which is not only going to impact Palestinians, but many other groups who are beginning to see, hopefully, more people who look like them, sound like them, come from the places where they come from, representing them in the halls of power. And at the same time, there's a very fierce movement here in the United States that is working against that. And so, it's an important moment and also a reflection of the kind of divided and dangerous times that we live in.
So there was one other question online that I want to share with you all, since we have time for one more, which is, what do activists on a campus like Georgetown, what can activists on a campus like Georgetown's campus do to support Palestinians?
I think one of the things that also struck me about Shireen Abu Akleh is her family, Lena, specifically her niece, the way she is carrying on that struggle and basically becoming the spokesperson and the campaign for her justice after she died. It is one of the things that I noticed also with a lot of the family members. It's always the women in the family who push the campaigns forward. And younger women too. And I think that's what we have majority in this room. If you have agreed with all of our analysis about who Shireen was, what she represented, we need many more Shireen that can be what Shireen was, that tell the story of Palestinians unfiltered to the world. And then I think that's the legacy that we want to keep. And I want that legacy to be a legacy of accountability, not impunity. And it's not going to happen without sustained action and demands here and abroad.
Yeah, I mean, all of you here are, you know, going to be going into careers, different places, journalism, foreign service. I don't know where you're all going to end up, but I do hope that, you know, you're definitely the elite of the elite in this room, right? You're going to end up doing amazing things. And I just hope that if you do go into fields like journalism, foreign service, you carry with you, you know, the way, the looks on those faces in that documentary, don't forget those. Because at the end of the day, yes, you're dealing with foreign policy issues, and we can so easily be divorced from the impact of those policy decisions, working in whatever, you know, whatever field we're in. But they really impact everyday human beings. And there is this blowback too from US foreign policy that impacts us, even if we're far away from what's taking place in you know, the Middle East or wherever it might be. So I just would hope that all of you would carry that with you in whatever work that you end up doing when you leave Georgetown.
Okay, so I want to thank you all again. Thank our panelists in particular. Thank you so much for being with us here today. And thanks to the MENA Forum for organizing this event and all of the co-sponsors and for all of you joining us today.